4 years into Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, billions continue to be funneled into Russia's war machine through sales of its oil and gas. On the receiving end of Russian exports is Kyiv's Western allies. Russia has made more than 883 billion euros in revenue from fossil fuel exports since the start of the war despite Western sanctions. That's 3 times more than the amount Ukraine has received in aid allocated by its allies. And according to data from the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, roughly 209 billion of that amount comes from EU member states. Until Ukraine cut the transit in January, the bloc continued importing pipeline gas from Russia, while Russian crude oil is still piped to Hungary and Slovakia today. As for gas, currently half of Russia's LNG exports go to the European Union. But a new roadmap launched by the EU's executive proposes a plan to phase out Moscow's lucrative gas sales to the continent by the end of 2027 and force gas companies to break contracts with the Kremlin. If implemented, the move could finally deliver a blow to Moscow, as oil and gas account for almost a third of Russia's state revenue and more than 60% of its exports. Campaigners say not enough is being done by governments in Europe and North America, as many Western policymakers fear skyrocketing energy prices in the scenario of cutting Russian fuel.
Let's bring in Anne-Sophie Corbeau here in Paris, the global research scholar at the Centre of Global Energy Policy at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Great to talk to you, Sophie. Let's begin on this odd paradox. On the one side, we are a situation where several EU countries are funding the aggressor in a war that they are condemning and also funding the resistance to the war.
Yes, it can indeed be controversial to see that we are still importing in 2025 some Russian pipeline gas and some Russian LNG, but it's true also that we are importing much less. In 2021, we were importing about 155 billion cubic meters. That was roughly about 40% of our demand. Last year, we imported 50, so this has decreased already by 2/3. And this year, if I am looking at the first trends over the first 5 months, we are going to import roughly 35 billion cubic meters. And indeed, the European Commission wants these numbers to decrease, first of all, by stopping everything which is spot sales, whether by pipeline or by LNG, after the end of this year, and then finalizing this dependency on Russian gas by the end of 2027. So they are working on that. There are things which are easier said than done. What we can say is that the global gas market right now is very tight, and this is probably why some countries are concerned about breaking abruptly the dependency on the Russian gas, because we have seen what has happened over the first part of the year. The prices were very, very high, and some industrials were extremely concerned about basically being bankrupt because of these very high gas prices. But at the same time, we know that progressively in 25 and definitely by 2027, there's going to be a lot of LNG coming to the market, which can effectively replace this pipeline gas and also this Russian LNG.
So let's look at some of those issues in context for Europe, because if we look at, I think, post-2022, February, after the full-scale invasion, you had the US, you had the UK banning Russian oil and gas, you had the EU banning Russian crude oil, but not gas. And I think if we then look more closely at the micro, we're then seeing Austria, we're seeing Hungary, aren't we, and Slovakia. And I guess that ultimately is the conundrum as to ultimately, for the EU moving forward, it moves forward at the level of its, well, if a player's dragging its feet, you all have to move at the same level. And I think ultimately it's about price. Does it spark energy prices across those countries and therefore Europe? Tell us about the crux of that, of what a switch off could do.
Yes, absolutely. But what you have to really understand is that even before the crisis and even before the start of the war in Ukraine, the markets were already very, very tight. I mean, we had record high gas prices as of September 2021. So in terms of, trying to find alternative sources of supply, whether by pipeline gas supplier or whether by LNG, I mean, it was already very difficult. What you have to realize is that in 2022, first of all, we were lucky that China basically dropped its LNG imports. That was because of the COVID situation. And also we took away some LNG supplies from other countries. And we had to pay them at a very, very high gas price. So that basically allowed us to replace some of the pipeline gas from Russia. And let's remember also that one very important fact, it was never the European Union which basically stopped importing Russian gas. It was actually Putin who cut the gas. Putin who cut the gas to Poland, who cut the gas to Bulgaria, who cut the gas to Germany. I mean, it was absolutely panic on board in summer 2022 when Nord Stream progressively dropped and finally reached zero by the end of the summer. I mean, people were absolutely panicked. And the second very important thing is that our consumption has dropped, but in particular, our industrial production has dropped massively. I mean, the very curious thing is that when it comes to fertilizer production, some of our fertilizer producers are closing shop here in Europe, and we have been importing fertilizers from Russia. So that doesn't really make sense to me, but this is a reality.
There's a few interesting to bear in mind here, Sophie. One of it is you talk about some areas where it's decreased via Turkey. So Russian gas going via Turkey into mainly Hungary and Slovakia. According to this data from the CREA, the quantity has risen in gas pipelined by 26% in January and February 2025 this year compared to the same period last year. And also, just can we talk about Germany for a moment as well? Because remember, it wasn't too many NATO summits ago, first time round when Trump was in office, that he was seen publicly admonishing Angela Merkel about the Nord Stream pipeline, saying, you're giving Russia this money whilst you've got these issues with Ukraine. There are some within her party, the CDU, that are talking about the possibility of the pipeline being reopened. Friedrich Merz seems to be the other way. What's your take on the German issue of Nord Stream?
I mean, honestly, I am in the opinion that this pipeline should never be reopened. Actually, it was actually never functioning because the pipeline which was functioning was a Nord Stream 1 pipeline, which is 55 billion cubic meters. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline was actually never certified, never put into operation. But what remains of that pipeline is potentially one of the two pipelines because Nord Stream 2 and Nord Stream 1 are each made of two different pipelines. And one pipeline was not sabotaged, and this pipeline could potentially be put in operation. But first of all, this is a very big pipeline. This is 27 billion cubic meters. This is roughly 7 to 8% of our current gas consumption. And in my opinion, the only reason why we would be considering reopening that pipeline is because of the peace agreement or a potential peace agreement in Ukraine. But the only reason why we have had this pipeline is also to bypass Ukraine. So allowing gas to go through that pipeline again would be really stabbing Ukraine in the back. And I don't think this is something that we should do. However, we could be potentially looking at having some limited amounts of Russian gas coming back in order to please some of the countries that you mentioned. I mean, Austria, Hungary, and Slovakia. Pipeline coming back through Ukraine, that would give some revenues to Ukraine, that would make some European countries happy, that will not be too much in terms of competition to US LNG exporters. So that would tick a certain number of boxes if this is what is really required to have a final peace in Ukraine. If this is a big if, of course.
Anne-Sophie, nice to talk to you this evening. Anne-Sophie Corbeau, the Global Research Scholar at the Centre for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University School. Thank you so much for your time this evening.